Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. This week, the United Kingdom has announced it is banning Chinese communications giant Huawei from the rollout of its 5G phone network. Is this a Cold War, an economic war, or something else? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Why doesn't this UK ban take full effect until 2027?
Well, that's a good question. The Johnson government has resisted pressure from other members of the Five Eyes Alliance, which is an intelligence sharing organisation. It has resisted pressure from the most powerful member of the Five Eyes Alliance, which has been the United States for some time. But the pressure has become accentuated recently, and Britain is, having left the EU or in the process of leaving the EU, I think is now in a position where it really can't stand up to that pressure. And so it was forced to choose between China and the United States in geopolitical terms. And Mr. Trump has claimed credit for this decision, so he hasn't really, spared Mr. Johnson's blushes too much. But the key point to note is the 7-year timeline. There is, I think, political and economic reasons for that. Politically, there may be a change of government in Washington, which may mean that Mr. Johnson can warm things up again with China. China's been deeply involved in the telecommunications infrastructure in the UK. And secondly, from an economic point of view, that 7-year time frame, because Britain's now made the commitment in principle to purge Huawei from the 5G network, that will give other telecommunications providers, which would have been cooperating with Huawei, companies like BT and Vodafone, it will give them time to make the necessary adjustments. As I say, Huawei have been deeply involved, and if they did this decision overnight, it will cost those companies a lot of money to remove the Huawei presence in 5G. It's a lot of hardware and a lot of money involved. So both political and economic reasons, I think, for the 7-year time frame.
Last year, it looked like New Zealand had joined the US and Australia in banning Huawei from our 5G network. What really happened?
Well, I think New Zealand has been hedging rather than balancing. Both Australia and New Zealand, almost simultaneously, New Zealand slightly after Australia, indicated to China that they didn't want Huawei involved in the developing 5G networks. But New Zealand framed it differently from Australia. Australia quite openly said it was national security concerns. Minister Little, who has responsibility for GCSB, said they had no concerns about the fact that the provider Huawei had a close relationship with the Chinese government. He said it was a technical matter, and that it was incumbent on Spark to indicate that a partner like Huawei did not involve what he called technical risks in the proposed 5G arrangement. So since then, Huawei have not been involved. Vodafone and I think 2 Degrees and Spark have been working with Nokia. But the interesting thing is, it was not a definitive no that New Zealand signalled to Huawei. And that meant that what appeared to be a tense situation was diffused. And China has agreed to upgrade the free trade agreement with New Zealand, and the relationship has taken an upward turn. So New Zealand has distinguished itself from Australia. It basically has prevented Huawei from participating in the 5G to this point, but has not ruled out future involvement if Huawei meets certain technical concerns that the New Zealand government has.
So what basically is the aim in trying to walk that fine line? What's New Zealand trying to achieve?
Well, I think New Zealand's in a position where, as a relatively small country, it exercises maximum leverage if it's not completely on the United States side or completely on China's side. And both of these superpowers are engaged in old-fashioned great power rivalry at the moment, and they are trying to pull third parties onto their respective sides. And I think New Zealand quite wisely it decided that hedging between the two superpowers is better than siding with one and balancing against the other. We have a very important economic relationship with China. We have a very important economic, political relationship with the United States. And besides, this makes a lot of sense because we in New Zealand do not agree with the worldview of either the Trump administration or Xi Jinping. So in a sense, you know, I think it's quite a sensible strategy. And if we can maintain good relations with both superpowers, I think most people in this country would say that's good for New Zealand.
To what extent is this actually all a battle between two superpowers for economic supremacy?
I think there is a bit of that involved, and certainly I think through New Zealand eyes, Mr. Trump's punishing of China is motivated by geopolitical concerns. I think there is a genuine nervousness in the United States about the surging Chinese economy. Having been number one for so long, I think the United States sees China as the only credible contender to the throne, so to speak. I don't think there's any prospect of China displacing the United States as the most powerful country, but politics is not often to do with objective realities, it's a lot to do with perceptions. So I do think that the Trump administration, which has been, you know, intensifying sanctions over China's policy towards Hong Kong, very outspoken in its criticism, has been, you know, almost benign in its attitude, the Trump administration, about Mr. Putin's interference in the Ukraine. The sanctions have been maintained during the Trump administration, but not because of the will of the administration, because they're in place and it would be politically too difficult to remove them. But there's no great enthusiasm for it. So I think, yeah, great power rivalry does play a role, but we have to keep this in perspective. This is not another Cold War. The world is completely different in the 21st century. There is no, the power is not concentrated in two countries in the shape of the United States and China, as it was during the Cold War in the shape of the Soviet Union and the United States. The fact of the matter is that today, great powers are more vulnerable, more interconnected. And China, for example, yeah, it has difficult relations with the United States at the moment, but it has very strong commercial relations with the United States. It has very strong commercial relations with Japan, a key partner of the United States, and it has very strong commercial relations with the EU, the world's biggest and most prosperous single market. So China has, if you like, it's unfortunate what's happened in relations between the United States and China, and that does have a ripple effect. But the world will continue despite this great power rivalry. So it's not going to paralyse the rest of the world.
This seeming international mistrust of China that seems to be growing, are we seeing evidence of that happening in New Zealand as well?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, I think New Zealand shares many of the concerns of its Five Eyes partners. Where we differ is how we express those concerns. So it's a difference in tactics rather than strategy per se. I think that New Zealand has been concerned about what appears to be the growing assertiveness of China in relations with both this country and others, and countries that we're very friendly with in the South Pacific region. China seems to be becoming more assertive, and we're seeing this in relation to Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I think that makes New Zealand feel very uncomfortable. And also, we've become very concerned about what appears to be Chinese influence operations in New Zealand. Certain mayors and politicians getting paid junkets to China. Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch in politics, and normally when people get freebies, there's normally a reason for it. So there's concerns about that, and I think, those geopolitical concerns that New Zealand has, China's role in the Pacific, and also evidence that China is becoming a little bit more assertive than it in 2020 or in recent years with New Zealand, in pressing its interests than it was, say, in 2008 when we concluded the free trade agreement.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.